Picture this for a moment, a world trembling on the edge of chaos, ruled by a paranoid Titan who has already swallowed his first 5 children. This is the reality into which a 6th child is born, a son named Zeus. His only chance for survival is to be hidden away in the deep, echoing darkness of a cave on the island of Crete, a secret so profound it would shape the destiny of the cosmos. And in that cave, surrounding the future king of the gods, stands a mysterious band of divine guardians whose thunderous dance and clashing spears would become the infant's only protection. These are the Curetes, and their story is one of the most pivotal yet often overlooked tales in all of Greek mythology. Without them, the entire pantheon as we know it might never have existed. We are about to journey back to the very foundations of myth, to a time of raw, primal power and desperate, cunning strategy. This is the story of the Curetes, the elite divine god whose sacred duty was to protect the infant Zeus from his own father, the devouring Cronus. They were more than just sentinels, they were performers of a sacred, deafening ritual, a magical deception that saved the life of a god. Their tale weaves together themes of loyalty, sacrifice, and the incredible power of noise to conceal a universe-altering secret. It's a narrative that asks us to consider who the true architects of order were in a world teetering on the brink of eternal tyranny, and it challenges us to remember the unsung heroes who operate from the shadows. So prepare to descend into that Cretan cave with us. We will uncover the obscure origins of the Curetes, exploring whether they were primordial earth spirits or a specially appointed martial order. We will break down their ingenious and noisy method of protection, a frantic dance that created a divine smokescreen. And finally, we will trace their lasting legacy, following their influence from the wilds of ancient Greece into the heart of Roman worship. This is a deep dive into one of mythology's most fascinating protective orders, a journey to meet the guardians whose fierce loyalty quite literally changed the world. Let's begin. To understand the sheer desperation of Rhea's plan and the absolute necessity of the Curetes, we must first look at the tyrant she was defying, Cronus. He was no ordinary father. He was the king of the Titans, a being of immense primordial power who had himself seized control of the cosmos by violently overthrowing his own father, Uranus. This act of patricide cast a long, dark shadow over his reign, for he was then given a prophecy that his own destiny would mirror that of his father. He too would be overthrown by one of his children. This prophecy became the central, obsessive fear that defined his rule, twisting what should have been paternal love into a monstrous, all-consuming paranoia. So when his sister and wife, Rhea, began to bear their children, his solution was one of horrific, cosmic simplicity. As each infant was born, first Hestia, then Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon Cronus did not cradle them. He opened his mighty jaws and swallowed each child whole, imprisoning them for eternity within his own divine belly. Imagine the profound grief and terror of Rhea, forced to witness the destruction of her own children one after another, powerless against the might of her husband and the cruel logic of his fear. The very act of birth became a sentence of death, a cycle of despair that seemed unbreakable. By the time Rhea was pregnant with her 6th child, the weight of this tragedy had become unbearable. She could not endure the loss of another newborn, but in her desperation, a spark of cunning defiance was born. She would not simply present this child to the same terrible fate. Her love as a mother and her fury as a wronged goddess fused into a single, brilliant and treacherous idea. She sought counsel, turning to her parents, Gaia, the earth, and Uranus, the sky, who understood the brutal nature of Cronus better than anyone. Together, they devised a plan of breathtaking audacity. Rhea would travel to the island of Crete when her time came, giving birth in secret within the hidden, labyrinthine caves of Mount Ida, far from the watchful eyes of her husband on Mount Othrys. This geographical separation was crucial. It was the first layer of deception, creating physical distance between the paranoid Titan and his potential usurper. Yet, giving birth in secret was only half the battle. A newborn god is not a silent, inconspicuous thing. His cries would be divine, carrying power and presence that could easily attract the attention of other deities, or worse, the Titans who served Cronus. The infant's very essence, his burgeoning divine power, would radiate like a beacon if left unprotected. This was not merely a matter of hiding a baby. It was a matter of concealing a cosmic event, of muffling the birth cries of a future king whose existence threatened the very foundations of the current world order. The danger was not just that Cronus would find him. It was that if he did, the cycle of tyranny would continue unbroken. The old gods would remain in power forever, and the potential for a new, more just era of rule would be extinguished before it could even draw its first breath. The entire fate of the universe was now resting on the shoulders of a single, helpless infant, and the success of a secret so fragile it could be shattered by a single, errant sound. This is the monumental, world-shaking peril that set the stage. It created a void, a desperate need for a specific kind of protection that was as clever as it was powerful, a need that only the Curetes could fill. With her heart pounding not just from the labor of childbirth but from the sheer audacity of her plan, Rhea moved with a mother's fierce resolve. She had given birth to Zeus, her sixth child, in the lush, secluded wilds of Crete, far from the golden halls of the Titans. But the most dangerous part of her gambit was yet to come. She now had to return to her husband, Cronus, and make him believe he had succeeded in consuming this child as he had all the others. Her solution was a masterpiece of misdirection, a deception built on the very arrogance and predictability of the tyrant she sought to fool. Rhea took a large, unassuming stone. Some traditions say it was from the very earth of Crete, still clinging to the raw power of Gaia, and she carefully, deliberately wrapped it in soft, white swaddling clothes. In the dim light, bundled tightly, this simple rock took on the shape and size of a newborn. It was a physical lie, a swaddled sacrifice offered to the all-devouring king. Imagine the scene in the throne room of the Titans. Rhea approaches Cronus, her face a mask of resigned submission, presenting the bundled stone as if it were her most recent sorrow. Cronus, so consumed by his paranoia and so assured of his own dominance, never once questions what he is given. His fear of being overthrown had blinded him to the possibility of such a simple, intimate trick. Without a moment's hesitation, without even unwrapping the cloth to glimpse his supposed son, he throws his head back and swallows the stone whole, believing he has once again secured his reign for eternity. It is a moment of profound irony. The king who consumed his children to maintain his power was finally, himself, being consumed by a deception. The stone, now sitting heavy in his gut, was a permanent, undigestible seed of his own eventual downfall. While Cronus rested, unaware of the ticking clock now lodged inside him, Rhea was already on her way back to Crete. This time she carried not a stone, but her living, breathing son, the infant Zeus. Her journey took her to the rugged peaks of Mount Ida, or, in other versions of the myth, into the deep, hidden chamber of the Dictaean cave. This was not a place of comfort and light. It was a primal, subterranean world of echoing drips and shadowy recesses, a place where the boundaries between the earth and the divine felt thin and permeable. Here, cradling the future king of the gods, Rhea faced her final, most heart-wrenching act. She could not stay. To remain with her son would be to lead his father directly to him. Her protection now had to take the form of absence. She had to place her absolute trust in the local powers of this wild island, entrusting her son's survival to the nymphs who animated the landscape and to the mysterious, martial figures who were already gathering at the cave's entrance. It was a leap of faith that required every ounce of her divine strength, leaving her most precious child in the hands of others, in a dark cave that had to become both a nursery and a fortress. The success of her entire rebellion, the very hope for a new cosmic order, now rested on what would happen in that cave after she walked away. And so, within that sacred cave, the guardians took their posts. But who exactly were these Curetes entrusted with the most important task in the cosmos? The answer is as layered and mysterious as the Cretan mountains they called home. They existed in a fascinating grey area between deity and spirit, their identities shifting depending on which ancient poet you consult. At their core, they were powerful, youthful male figures, their very name, Curetes, closely related to the Greek word for young men, kuroi. This evokes an image of vibrant, athletic energy, of beings in the prime of their strength. But were they a band of young gods, lesser deities in their own right? Or were they something else, powerful earth spirits known as daemons, embodiments of the untamed Cretan wilderness where Zeus was hidden? This ambiguity is central to their character. They were intrinsically tied to the land, to the raw, primal forces of nature that thrived far from the ordered realms of the older Titans. Their power didn't come from golden thrones. It was drawn from the deep, rumbling energy of the earth itself, from the forests and the rugged peaks of Mount Ida. This inherent mystery is only deepened by the Curetes' frequent conflation with other, strikingly similar groups from Greek mythology. Ancient writers often wove their stories together with those of the Corybantes, who were ecstatic, drum-beating attendants of the goddess Cybele, and the dactyls, smiths, and magicians associated with Mount Ida. Think of it as if different regions and traditions each had their own version of a powerful, secretive brotherhood, and over centuries of storytelling, the lines between them became wonderfully blurred. This wasn't seen as a contradiction by the ancients, but rather as an indication of a profound, widespread archetype, the concept of a divine, martial fraternity that operated at the boundaries of the civilized world. For our story, however, the Curetes stand apart as the specific, appointed guardians of the infant Zeus, their legend forever cemented to that one critical mission on Crete. Their elemental nature is a crucial piece of the puzzle. As spirits deeply connected to the earth, they were the perfect counter to the cosmic, tyrannical power of Cronus. Cronus represented an old, rigid order, a top-down dominion over the universe. The Curetes, in contrast, were of the world, not merely above it. They were the manifestation of the land's own protective will. This explains why they were so often depicted as armed dancers, their movements both a martial drill and a form of nature magic. They didn't just guard the cave's entrance with swords and shields. They channeled the very vitality of the wilderness, creating a protective barrier that was as much about spiritual energy as it was about physical defense. They were the mountain's immune system, rising up to protect the divine child who represented a new beginning, a new order that would be more in harmony with the world they embodied. Now, with the infant Zeus safely hidden in the cave's deepest chamber, the real work of the Curetes began. Their mission was a masterpiece of misdirection, but not the kind you might expect. This was not about perfect silence or remaining utterly unseen. On the contrary, their strategy was one of deliberate, overwhelming noise. The core of their sacred duty was to mask the infant's cries, and they achieved this not through stealth, but by creating a controlled, thunderous cacophony that turned the entire cave into an impenetrable audiological fortress. Imagine the scene within the echoing stone chamber, lit only by flickering torchlight. The Curetes began a wild, rhythmic, and intensely martial dance. They were not merely standing guard, they were performing a ritual of protection, their bodies moving in a powerful, synchronized stomp that echoed the primal heartbeat of the mountain itself. And with each explosive movement, they would slam their bronze-tipped spears against the hard, metallic surfaces of their shields. The resulting sound was not a simple clang, but a continuous, deafening roar, a wall of pure, percussive energy that filled the air and vibrated through the very rock. This was far more than just an attempt to drown out a baby's wails. The purpose of this orchestrated chaos was layered and deeply clever. First, on the most practical level, the relentless crashing of metal on metal was so loud, so all-consuming, that it completely swallowed any other sound emanating from the cave. The faintest cry from the infant Zeus would be lost instantly, rendered inaudible against this divine racket. But the second, more profound reason was magical and energetic in nature. The ancient Greeks understood that sound held power. It could influence the world on a spiritual level. The Curetes were not just making noise, they were generating a powerful, chaotic energy field with their dance and clashing weapons. This energetic disturbance acted as a smokescreen, a form of acoustic camouflage designed to disorient any divine senses that might be scouring the world for the missing god-child. It scrambled the very scent of his divinity. Think of it like trying to hear a whisper in the middle of a raging hurricane, or trying to spot a single candle's flame while staring directly into the sun. For a being like Cronus, whose power was vast and whose perception spanned the cosmos, a single, pure signal of a newborn god's power would have been a clear beacon. But the Curetes, through their frantic performance, created a storm of conflicting signals. They turned the cave from a hiding spot into a roaring, indecipherable blur of sound and vibration. It was the perfect deception. By drawing so much attention to themselves through sheer auditory violence, they made the actual secret within impossible to detect. The cave wasn't silent. It was the noisiest, most chaotic place on earth, and in that chaos the future king of the gods grew, his presence perfectly concealed behind a shield of divine clamor. While the Curetes provided a thunderous shield of sound and martial energy, the infant god's survival depended on something far more fundamental: sustenance and nurturing care. Within the shadowy cave, another layer of divine protection was at work, one that was gentle, maternal, and life-giving. This vital role fell to a group of beings as intrinsically tied to the wild landscape of Crete as the Curetes themselves, the nurturing nymphs. Foremost among them was the figure of Amalthea, a name that would become synonymous with divine providence. Her story, however, comes to us in two beautiful, intertwined versions, each adding a different texture to the myth. In the most common and striking telling, Amalthea was not a humanoid nymph at all, but a magnificent, supernatural she-goat. Her hide was described as shimmering, and her horns flowed with an endless supply of nectar and ambrosia, the very food and drink of the gods. It was this divine goat who offered her udder to the infant Zeus, providing him with the milk he needed to grow and thrive. This was no ordinary nourishment. It was a potent, magical substance that fortified his nascent divinity, fueling the immense power that lay dormant within him. The alternative version of the tale introduces Amalthea as a nymph, a beautiful daughter of the Cretan king Melesius. In this iteration, she was the owner of the miraculous goat, a cherished companion of the wilds. Here, her role shifts from direct provider to a careful guardian and caretaker. She would have been the one to guide the goat to the infant, to milk it, and to gently feed the future king, ensuring he received the sustenance he required. This version emphasizes a more personal, tender bond between the nymph and the child, framing her not just as a source of food, but as a surrogate mother figure in Rhea's absence. In both versions, the symbolism is profound and powerful. The goat represents an untamed, primal form of nourishment, a direct connection to the earth's boundless fertility. By being fed from a creature of the wild, Zeus was absorbing the raw, unrefined power of the natural world he would one day rule, grounding his cosmic authority in the very essence of the land that protected him. The theme of divine nourishment did not end with milk. Completing this holistic system of care were the Melissa nymphs, whose very name means bees. These were not just any nature spirits, they were the embodiments of the sacred, industrious energy of the beehive. According to the myth, they contributed to Zeus's upbringing by feeding him honey, a substance the ancient Greeks regarded with near reverence. Honey was more than just a sweetener. It was considered a food of the gods, a symbol of wisdom, eloquence, and even immortality. In many ancient cultures, honey was linked to prophecy and divine inspiration, making it the perfect food for a future king of the gods. The Melissa nymphs, therefore, were providing Zeus with more than just calories. They were offering him the gifts of persuasive speech, keen judgment, and the golden, flowing wisdom he would need to command the cosmos and mediate the disputes of gods and mortals alike. Their contribution was one of mental and spiritual fortification, complementing the physical strength granted by Amalthea's milk. This creates a beautifully balanced picture of Zeus's early life. He was surrounded by a perfect, symbiotic team of protectors. On the outside, the Curetes created a barrier of controlled chaos and martial fury, their clashing spears and stomping dance warding off any cosmic threats. On the inside, the world was soft, warm, and life-sustaining. The nymphs provided a nursery-like atmosphere, ensuring the infant god was fed, comforted, and nurtured. Amalthea, whether as goat or nymph, gave him the physical strength to grow, while the Melissa nymphs gifted him the intellectual and spiritual tools for his future rule. This division of labor is deeply meaningful. It shows that the architects of this plan understood that saving Zeus required more than just hiding him, it required raising him. He needed to be both protected and prepared, shielded from immediate danger while being equipped for his immense future destiny. The wild cave on Crete was not just a fortress, it was a cradle and a school where the future ruler of the universe received everything he needed from the primal, untamed world itself. While the milk of Amalthea and the honey of the Melissa nymphs provided a crucial foundation, the infant Zeus's divine nature required something far more potent to fully awaken his cosmic potential. This brings us to the most exclusive and powerful substances in all of Greek mythology, ambrosia and nectar. These were not mere food and drink, they were the fundamental sources of immortality and divine power, the very essence that separated the gods from mortals and sustained their eternal, flawless existence. Ambrosia, often imagined as a food, perhaps a heavenly bread, fruit, or a fragrant, otherworldly paste, was said to confer agelessness and invulnerability. Nectar, its liquid counterpart, was a divine beverage that flowed with the power of life itself, the wine of the gods that fortified their divine blood and vitality. For a god to consume these substances was to continuously reaffirm their divine state, to burn with an inner fire that never dimmed. The fact that the infant Zeus was fed this celestial diet from his earliest days is a critical detail, underscoring that his upbringing was not merely about keeping him hidden, but about actively forging him into the being he was destined to become. We can only imagine the careful, sacred rituals that must have taken place within that Cretan cave to administer these powerful substances. The nymphs, particularly Amalthea, would have been the most likely caretakers for this profound task. Picture a nymph carefully collecting dewdrops of shimmering nectar from the horn of the divine goat, or gently offering the infant god tiny morsels of ambrosia. This was not a simple feeding, it was an act of consecration. With every drop of nectar and every bite of ambrosia, Zeus's mortal-like infancy was being systematically overwritten by his inherent, overwhelming divinity. His cells were being woven with threads of eternity, his muscles fortified with strength that could one day hold the lightning bolt, and his mind sharpened with the cosmic awareness needed to govern the universe. This supernatural nourishment accelerated his growth and power in a way that mere divine milk could not, ensuring that the child hidden in the cave was rapidly evolving into a threat capable of challenging his tyrannical father. Some ancient sources even hint at a more direct role for the Curetes in this process, suggesting they were not just noisy gods but active participants in the god's sustenance. As youthful, energetic deities closely linked to the Earth's raw power, they may have been responsible for procuring or even generating these divine substances through their ecstatic dances. Their rhythmic stomping and spear clashing could have been a form of sympathetic magic, a ritual designed to draw the energy of ambrosia and nectar up from the very world itself, channeling it directly to the infant. This paints an even more complete picture of the cave's operation. The Curetes' deafening performance served the dual purpose of creating an audiological smokescreen while simultaneously conducting a powerful rite of empowerment, fueling the god they were protecting with the very energy he needed to one day seize his throne. The profound significance of this divine diet cannot be overstated. It meant that Zeus was never truly a helpless baby in the human sense. He was a cosmic prince in incubation, receiving the ultimate royal treatment. While his siblings languished, trapped and dormant within the belly of Cronus, Zeus was free, growing stronger, wiser, and more powerful with each passing day, his body and spirit constantly saturated with the food of immortality. This gave him an insurmountable advantage. By the time he emerged from the cave, he was not just a survivor, he was a fully realized god, brimming with a power nurtured by the most potent forces in existence. The ambrosia and nectar were the final, crucial ingredients in a grand recipe designed by fate and his mother's love, a recipe that meticulously prepared him not just to escape his father, but to defeat him, to overthrow the old order, and to establish a new reign that would define the cosmos for millennia to come. So, what was daily life actually like for the young Zeus, growing up in this thunderous, hidden nursery? The myth gives us the grand strokes of his protection, but to truly understand the god he would become, we need to peer into the rhythms of his secluded childhood. This was not a period of passive waiting, it was an active, intensive training ground. The Curetes, fierce and disciplined as they were, would have been far more than just a noise-making perimeter guard. As elite martial figures, their instinct would have been to forge the young god in their own image, to prepare the weapon that would one day be unleashed upon Cronus. From the moment Zeus could stand and grip a training sword, his education in the arts of war would have begun. Picture the young god, not yet tall enough to look a Curete in the eye, being taught how to parry a blow with a small wooden shield, his movements mimicked and corrected by these towering, armored dancers. Their lessons would have been woven into the very fabric of their protective ritual. The rhythmic stomping that masked his cries also taught him balance and footwork. The disciplined, synchronized clashing of spears instructed him in timing, rhythm, and the controlled application of force. Every element of their divine clamor was a lesson in combat, transforming the cave from a simple hiding place into the world's most secret and sacred military academy. Yet his education extended far beyond the martial. The Curetes were not just soldiers, they were spirits of the wild Cretan landscape. Their power was drawn directly from the mountain, the forests, and the untamed earth. It stands to reason, then, that a crucial part of their guardianship would have been to introduce Zeus to this primal source of strength. They would have taken the young god out of the cave, under the cover of dense foliage or the veil of night, to walk the slopes of Mount Ida. Here, they would have taught him to read the signs of the wilderness, the language of animal tracks, the whisper of the wind through the pines, the hidden meanings of specific plants and springs. This was not a gentle nature walk, it was an education in raw, elemental power. They were showing him how to draw strength from the rock beneath his feet and how to command the loyalty of the natural world, lessons that would later inform his role as a weather god who could summon storms and shake the earth with his thunder. The god who would one day rule from the pristine peak of Olympus was first taught to revere the power of the earth in the rugged highlands of Crete. This unique upbringing, split between rigorous combat drills and deep communion with nature, undoubtedly shaped the core of Zeus's character in profound ways. From the Curetes, he learned the virtues of discipline, loyalty, and the strategic use of strength, not as a blunt instrument like his father, but as a precise and honed tool. Their unwavering dedication to a single, sacred mission modeled for him the importance of commitment and the power of a brotherhood bound by a common cause. These were the foundational principles he would later look for in his own allies when he gathered the gods to wage the Titanomachy. Simultaneously, his immersion in the wild taught him a different kind of authority. He learned that true power was not just about domination, but about understanding the fundamental systems of the world, about harmony as much as force. This duality became the hallmark of his reign. He was the god of justice who wielded the terrifying lightning bolt, the enforcer of order who was also the protector of guests and supplicants. The secluded cave on Crete, with its combination of martial clatter and earthy wisdom, was the crucible where this balanced, formidable ruler was forged, long before he ever laid claim to his celestial throne. But the time for hiding and preparation could not last forever. The young god, now bursting with the power nurtured by ambrosia and honed by the Curetes' training, had a destiny to fulfill. The moment arrived when the secluded life in the Cretan cave was no longer enough. The cosmic injustice demanded confrontation. Zeus, now a formidable and fully realized deity, left the protective shadows of Mount Ida and ventured out into the wider world, his purpose clear: to find a way to free his siblings and challenge the tyrannical rule of his father, Cronus. This was not a reckless charge into battle, however. The god who had been raised on strategy and discipline knew that brute force alone would not be enough against the king of the Titans. He needed a plan, a clever and unexpected tactic to undo the terrible act of consumption that had defined his father's reign. For this, he turned to a figure renowned for her wisdom and cunning, the oceanid nymph Metis, whose name itself means wise counsel or craft. Metis presented Zeus with a brilliantly simple yet devastating solution. She prepared a powerful potion, a draught so potent it would force even a Titan's body to violently reject its contents. The specific ingredients of this emetic are lost to time, but ancient sources often describe it as a mixture of mustard and wine, a deceptively ordinary concoction imbued with divine power. The true genius of the plan, however, lay in its delivery. Zeus did not march into his father's court and declare war. Instead, he approached Cronus in a guise of submission, perhaps even as a humble cupbearer. He offered the potent mixture to his unsuspecting father, presenting it as a refreshing drink or a gesture of respect. Cronus, his arrogance and paranoia so deeply ingrained that he never suspected a threat from within his own household, drank the potion down without a second thought. The effect was immediate and cataclysmic. The Titan king was seized with violent, convulsive retching. One by one, from the depths of his being, he disgorged the children he had swallowed years before. First came the stone, still wrapped in its swaddling clothes, then the 5 immortal siblings, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon, emerging unharmed, fully grown, and brimming with a righteous fury that had been festering for years in the darkness. The release of his siblings was not the end of the conflict, but the beginning of the greatest war the cosmos had ever witnessed. The freed Olympians, eternally grateful to Zeus and burning with vengeance against their father, immediately aligned with him. But Cronus was not alone. Most of the other Titans, loyal to the old order and fearful of this new, uprising power, rallied to his defense. This set the stage for the Titanomachy, a brutal, decade-long war that would decide the fate of the universe. The battleground was the very fabric of the world, with the Olympians and their allies making their stronghold on Mount Olympus, while the Titans held fast to Mount Othrys. The descriptions of this conflict in ancient poetry are staggering in their scale and violence. The Titans hurled entire mountains as projectiles, while Zeus, having acquired his signature weapon, the lightning bolt, forged for him by the Cyclopes he freed from Tartarus, unleashed celestial fury from the skies. The very earth shook, and the seas boiled as these primordial forces clashed in a struggle for ultimate sovereignty. It is within this context of world-shattering conflict that we must look back and recognize the true, indispensable role of the Curetes. Their thunderous dance in the Cretan cave was not merely an isolated event. It was the essential, foundational act that made the entire Titanomachy possible. Every lightning bolt cast by Zeus, every strategic command issued by Poseidon in the thick of battle, every ounce of fury that fueled Hera's assault, all of it traced its origin directly back to that one successfully guarded secret. Without the Curetes' unwavering protection during those vulnerable early years, there would have been no Zeus to challenge Cronus. The stone would never have been swallowed, the siblings would never have been freed, and the old, tyrannical order of the Titans would have persisted unchallenged. The Curetes were the silent architects of this cosmic revolution. While they may not have been depicted on the front lines of the war itself, their contribution was more critical than any single act of battlefield heroism. They were the guardians of the spark, the ones who ensured that the flame of a new cosmic order was not extinguished before it could even catch light. Their success in that single, sacred mission allowed for the rise of the Olympians, the establishment of a new pantheon, and the dawn of the classical age of Greek mythology itself. With the dust of the Titanomachy finally settled and a new pantheon established on Mount Olympus, a question naturally arises: what became of the Curetes? They had executed their sacred duty flawlessly, protecting the infant Zeus when he was at his most vulnerable, and in doing so, they irrevocably altered the fate of the cosmos. In the highly structured, honor-bound society of the Greek gods, such a monumental service could not go unrecognized. The concept of charis, a powerful, reciprocal relationship of favor, grace, and gratitude, was a fundamental pillar of divine and human interaction. A gift or service demanded a reciprocal act of honor. To fail in this was to violate a sacred trust and risk losing face and influence. For Zeus, now the supreme ruler, acknowledging his debt to the Curetes was not just a matter of sentiment. It was a vital act of statecraft, a public demonstration that the new king rewarded his loyal allies and upheld the very principles of justice and order he now represented. So, did these earthy guardians from Crete ascend to gleaming thrones in the celestial court of Olympus? The myths suggest a more nuanced and perhaps even more fitting reward. Rather than being brought into the centralized bureaucracy of Olympus as permanent courtiers, the Curetes were elevated in status and granted a profound, enduring honor. They became the founders and perpetual leaders of a sacred mystery cult. This was a far greater privilege than it might initially seem. In the ancient world, mystery cults were among the most revered religious institutions, offering initiates secret knowledge, spiritual purification, and the promise of a blessed afterlife. By establishing the Curetes as the central figures of their own mystic tradition, Zeus was granting them a form of immortality that transcended mere power. They became eternal objects of worship, their story enshrined in ritual and their names whispered in the most sacred ceremonies. This was the ultimate charis, a transformation from active protectors to foundational religious icons, ensuring their legacy would be celebrated by mortals for all time. The primary center of this veneration was appropriately their homeland of Crete. In the city of Knossos, they were worshipped as revered deities in their own right. Historical and archaeological evidence points to the Curete Street in the city, a processional way likely used in their religious festivals. These were not quiet, somber affairs. The rituals dedicated to the Curetes echoed their primal, protective dance. They involved ecstatic dancing, the clashing of weapons, and the same kind of percussive, overwhelming noise that once shielded the infant Zeus. Participants would reenact the myth, losing themselves in a frenzy of movement and sound, seeking to connect with the raw, protective energy of these divine gods. By sponsoring and sanctifying these cults, Zeus effectively made the Curetes the guardians of his own mythological narrative. Every time a ritual was performed, the story of his salvation was retold, reinforcing the legitimacy of his rule and the righteousness of the new Olympian order. Their reward was to become living, or rather, divine monuments to the founding myth of the Zeusian era. Beyond the borders of Crete, their influence spread, their identities often merging with other similar groups like the Corybantes in Anatolia. This syncretism wasn't a dilution of their legacy, but a testament to its power. As the story of Zeus's infancy traveled, so did the need for the Curetes' protective, frenzied energy. They became associated with the upbringing of other divine children, most notably Dionysus, whom they were said to have protected with their trademark clamor from the wrath of Rhea. This repeated role cements their position in the divine hierarchy as the go-to guardians for imperiled young gods, the specialists in divine security during the vulnerable childhood of a deity. Their reward was a defined, respected, and eternal niche. They weren't just retired heroes, they were given a perpetual job description, one that continually reaffirmed their importance and connected them directly to the ongoing stories of the Olympian pantheon. This enduring role highlights a profound truth about the new order Zeus created. His reign was not about erasing the old powers, but about integrating them. The Curetes, as spirits of the wild earth, represented a primal, chaotic force that was older than the Titans. By honoring them so profoundly, Zeus was acknowledging the debt his civilized, Olympian rule owed to the untamed, raw power of the natural world. They became a sacred bridge between the old chthonic forces and the new celestial order. Their place was not in the glittering halls of Olympus, but in the sacred groves and echoing caves where mortals could connect with that primal energy. Their ultimate reward was to be forever remembered not just as gods, but as essential partners in the foundation of the world as the ancient Greeks knew it. Their thunderous dance in a Cretan cave resonated through the ages, earning them an honored place in ritual and myth, a permanent caress from a king who never forgot the debt he owed to the fierce dancers who saved his life. The story of Zeus's infancy may be their most famous charge, but the divine portfolio of the Curetes extended far beyond that single, world-altering nursery duty. To view them only as the gods of a Cretan cave is to miss their broader, fascinating presence woven throughout the intricate tapestry of Greek myth. They appear again and again as specialists in divine security, particularly when a young god's life is threatened by the formidable jealousy of Rhea. This pattern is brilliantly illustrated in the tumultuous early life of Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstatic release. When the mortal princess Semele was tragically incinerated after being tricked by Rhea into gazing upon Zeus's true divine form, the king of the gods performed a desperate act of rescue. He sewed the unborn Dionysus into his own thigh, carrying the child to term himself. Once born, the infant god was immediately in peril, for Hera's wrath was relentless. To protect his son, Zeus turned to the proven experts. He entrusted the baby Dionysus to his own mother, Rhea, or in some versions directly to the Curetes, who took the child to the remote and mystical mountains of Nysa. There, the familiar, thunderous ritual began anew. Just as they had on Crete, the Curetes surrounded the divine infant with a protective frenzy of dance and the deafening clatter of their weapons. They became the guardians of the vine, their wild, percussive rites a perfect match for the ecstatic, untamable nature of the god they were protecting. This was not a simple repetition of their duty to Zeus, it was an evolution of their role. With Dionysus, their protective clamor was not just about masking cries, but about fostering the very essence of the god's being, a state of ritual madness and ecstatic liberation. Their dances became a foundational part of the Dionysian mysteries, the secret rites that would later sweep through the ancient world. In this second great guardianship, we see the Curetes cemented as the go-to solution for endangered divine children, their methods so effective that they became a recurring motif in the struggle between Zeus's philandering and Hera's vengeful fury. Their success with Dionysus ensured the god of the vine would survive to bring his gifts of wine, theater, and religious frenzy to humanity, adding another layer to their legacy as protectors of cosmic diversity. Their exploits were not confined solely to the nursery, however. The Curetes also stepped onto the stage of heroic saga, appearing in one of the most famous collective endeavors of Greek heroes, the Caledonian boar hunt. When King Oeneus of Calydon neglected to sacrifice to Artemis, the offended goddess sent a monstrous boar of immense size and ferocity to ravage his lands. The creature destroyed crops, killed livestock, and terrorized the population, prompting Oeneus to call upon the greatest heroes of Greece to hunt it down. A glittering assembly answered the call, including figures like the huntress Atalanta, the mighty Meleager, and the twins Castor and Pollux. Among this legendary company, some ancient sources also place the Curetes, though here the term becomes a bit more ambiguous. In the context of this story, Curetes may refer not to the divine guardians of Zeus, but to a specific warlike tribe from Aetolia, the region where Calydon was located. This highlights the fascinating duality of their name. It could denote either the specific group of divine protectors or a human tribe known for its martial prowess. Whether they were the divine guards themselves or their mortal namesakes, their involvement in the hunt had dire consequences. The most popular version of the myth describes a contingent of Curetes from the city of Pleuron joining the heroic fray. The hunt was a success, with the boar finally brought down after a fierce struggle, but the real tragedy unfolded afterward over the division of the spoils. The hero Meleager, who had struck the killing blow, awarded the boar's prized hide to the brave Atalanta, with whom he had fallen in love. This act enraged the Curetes, who felt their honor was slighted as they believed they had a right to the trophy. A bitter quarrel erupted, escalating into a full-scale war between the Caledonians and the Curetes. In the brutal fighting that followed, Meleager fought fiercely in defense of his city, but when he killed his uncles who were among the Curetes' leaders, his own mother, Althea, was consumed by a vengeful rage. In a horrifying act, she retrieved a magical log from a chest, a log that held the secret to her son's life, and threw it into a fire, causing Meleager to die in agony. This tragic episode demonstrates how the name Curetes was woven into the complex web of heroic honor, vengeance, and fate, connecting these figures, whether divine or mortal, to some of the most poignant human dramas in mythology. Beyond these well-known tales, the Curetes were also actors in smaller, yet significant mythological conflicts that reinforced their identity as a powerful, territorial brotherhood. One such story involves a dispute over a parcel of land with none other than the god Apollo himself. The conflict arose in the region of Aetolia, a place the Curetes considered their ancestral domain. When Apollo sought to establish a new oracle there, the Curetes fiercely contested his claim, defending their turf against the encroaching Olympian. The confrontation did not escalate into an all-out war, but was instead settled through a trial of divine skill. The two sides agreed to a contest, and the Curetes, confident in their own power, were ultimately defeated by Apollo in a musical competition. As a penalty for their loss, they were forced to dedicate their cherished, finely wrought armor to the god. This myth is incredibly revealing. It shows the Curetes as proud and confident enough to challenge a major Olympian deity, asserting their autonomy and their deep connection to their land. Their defeat is not one of humiliation, but rather an integration into the new order. By dedicating their armor to Apollo, they are, in a way, acknowledging his authority while still retaining their distinct identity. It paints them as more than just silent guards. They are a force to be negotiated with, a power with their own pride, territory, and place in the complex political landscape of the divine world, completing a portrait that is far richer and more dynamic than any single story could provide. So the myth of the Curetes protecting the infant Zeus was not just a story confined to the pages of epic poetry. It burst forth from the narrative and became a living, breathing force in the daily religious life of the ancient Greeks. This transition from cosmic backstory to tangible cult practice reveals how deeply this band of divine gods was woven into the social and spiritual fabric of communities, particularly on their home island of Crete. In cities like Knossos, the very heart of Minoan and later Greek civilization on the island, the Curetes were not distant figures of legend but active, present deities worthy of their own sacred spaces and elaborate festivals. Archaeological evidence, including inscriptions and the famous Curete Street, points to their veneration as foundational to the city's identity. This was a cult that physically echoed its myth. The processions and rituals conducted in their honor would have retraced the steps of their primordial dance, turning the city itself into a symbolic extension of that sacred Cretan cave. One of the most significant centers of their worship was the town of Palekastro in eastern Crete, where a powerful and unique hymn was discovered, dedicated to a deity known as the greatest Kuros, or the greatest youth. This hymn, sung by young Cretan men, explicitly invokes the Curetes and invites this divine youth to return to the city each year to leap for the sake of its prosperity. This ritualistic leaping is a direct echo of the Curetes' own ecstatic, stomping dance that shielded the infant Zeus. Here we see the myth perfectly mirrored in the cult. The frantic, physical movement that once protected a god was now being reenacted to protect and invigorate an entire community. It was a form of sympathetic magic. By channeling the energy of the Curetes, the young men of Palekastro were believed to channel divine power directly into the fields, the flocks, and the very walls of their city, ensuring fertility, strength, and good fortune for the coming year. The rituals dedicated to the Curetes were anything but quiet and contemplative. They were vibrant, noisy, and intensely physical affairs, designed to replicate the very same cacophony that saved Zeus. Imagine the scene during one of their major festivals. Groups of young male worshippers, their bodies painted or clad in ritual armor, engaging in a wild, rhythmic dance. The air would have been filled with the overwhelming sound of drums pounding, pipes wailing, and the deliberate metallic clash of swords against shields. This wasn't merely a performance for an audience, it was an immersive, participatory event intended to induce a state of collective ecstasy. The participants weren't just telling a story about the Curetes. In that moment, through the frenzy of the dance and the thunder of the noise, they became the Curetes. They were tapping into that same primal, protective energy, breaking down the barrier between the mythic past and the living present. This ecstatic worship shares a clear family resemblance with the rites of other deities like Dionysus or Cybele, where loud music and frantic dance were pathways to divine communion. But for the Curetes, the goal was always centered on protection and the infusion of youthful vitality. Beyond the island of Crete, the veneration of the Curetes spread, most notably to the magnificent city of Ephesus in Ionia, on the coast of modern-day Turkey. Here, their role evolved fascinatingly to intertwine with the worship of the city's great patron goddess, Artemis of Ephesus. In Ephesus, an official body of priests known as the Essenes held the title of Curetes, forming a sacred college responsible for performing the mysteries of the goddess and, according to some sources, overseeing the eternal flame that burned in her temple. This connection brilliantly demonstrates how the Curetes' divine function as protectors was adapted to a new urban context. In Ephesus, they were not just guardians of a hidden infant, but the spiritual guardians of the entire city-state, their sacred duties ensuring the continued favor of its powerful goddess and, by extension, the city's safety and prosperity. Their presence in the very heart of one of the ancient world's most important metropolises shows how their cult could transcend its rustic Cretan origins to become a cornerstone of civic religion. This leads us to their profound social function. The Curetes were not only protectors of cities but also the divine patrons of a critical life transition, the passage of young men into adulthood. In many Greek city-states, young males on the cusp of manhood would undergo rigorous initiation rites, often held in secluded locations outside the city walls. These rites, which could involve endurance tests, military training, and ritual dances, were designed to strip away their childhood identity and forge them into capable warriors and citizens. The Curetes, as a band of perfected, divine youths themselves, served as the ultimate role models for this process. Their myth embodied the ideals of martial brotherhood, disciplined strength, and unwavering loyalty to a cause greater than themselves. By performing dances that imitated the Curetes, These young initiates were symbolically aligning themselves with this powerful archetype, internalizing the virtues they would need to become the future protectors of their own communities. The cult of the Curetes, therefore, acted as a crucial bridge between the divine and human worlds, transforming the mythological protectors of a god into the spiritual blueprint for an entire generation of Greek men. This sacred, thunderous dance that echoed through Cretan caves and city festivals had a name, the Pyrrhic or the Pyrrhic dance. To understand this ritual is to understand the very essence of the Curetes' power. This was no simple folk dance. It was a full-blown martial spectacle, a choreographed reenactment of their primordial act of protection. Imagine a troop of young, vigorous men, their bodies glistening with sweat and perhaps adorned in lightweight, ceremonial armor, moving in a complex, rhythmic pattern. Their steps were not light and graceful, but heavy, aggressive stomps and leaps, mimicking the movements of soldiers in close-quarters combat, advancing, retreating, parrying, and striking. The core of the performance, the element that connected it directly back to the myth, was the deliberate, percussive clash of their weapons. They would beat their swords against their shields with a force that was both musical and militaristic, creating that same wall of sound that once shielded the infant Zeus. The dance was a living memory, a way for the community to physically participate in the foundational story of their world, channeling the frantic energy of that cave on Mount Ida into the heart of their own sacred spaces. But the soundscape of these rites was not created by weapons alone. To achieve the truly overwhelming, disorienting cacophony necessary for the ritual, other instruments were employed, each adding a unique layer to the divine noise. Among the most important were the crembola, small, metallic cymbals that performers would clash together in their hands. The sound of the crembola was sharp, piercing, and incessant, a high-frequency clatter that cut through the deeper sounds of the stomping and shield beating, adding a shimmering, almost frantic texture to the overall noise. Then there was the tympanon, a type of frame drum, similar to a tambourine but often without the jingles. When struck, the tympanon produced a deep, resonant, and hypnotic thrum, a rhythmic pulse that served as the foundational heartbeat of the entire performance. This combination of sounds was meticulously designed. The deep boom of the drum and the stomping feet represented the earth, the primal power of Gaia. The metallic shriek of the cymbals and the clang of steel on bronze evoked the celestial, the brilliant, terrifying power of the divine. Together, they created a sonic representation of the entire cosmos, a controlled chaos that mirrored the moment the old world order was being secretly overturned. This leads us to the most crucial aspect of these rituals. They were not merely theatrical reenactments for entertainment. In the ancient worldview, these performances were believed to possess genuine, tangible power, what scholars call apotropaic magic. The word apotropaic comes from the Greek for to turn away, and that was precisely the function of the Curetic dances. The overwhelming noise, the aggressive movements, and the fierce energy of the armed dancers were thought to create a spiritual force field. Just as the original clamor confused Cronus and masked the infant god's presence, this ritual reenactment was believed to repel malevolent spirits, ward off curses, and create a purified, protected space for the community. It was a form of spiritual hygiene, a collective effort to batter back the chaotic and evil influences that threatened civic order and agricultural fertility. By performing the dance, the participants became active agents in their own protection, summoning the divine guardians to once again stand watch, not over a single cave, but over their entire city, their fields, and their homes. The social dimension of these rites was equally profound. The performance of the Pyrrhic dance was typically the domain of young men, often those on the cusp of adulthood. Participating in this complex, physically demanding ritual was a rite of passage in itself. It taught them discipline, coordination, and the importance of moving as a single, cohesive unit, a vital skill for the hoplite warriors they would become. By embodying the Curetes, these youths were internalizing the virtues of the divine gods: strength, loyalty, and the willingness to use their power for the collective good. The festival thus served a dual purpose. On a spiritual level, it warded off evil and secured divine favor. On a social level, it forged the next generation of citizen soldiers, binding them together through a shared, sacred experience and instilling in them the very ethos that defined the protectors of Zeus. The dance was more than a memory. It was a machine for building identity, ensuring that the legacy of the Curetes lived on not just in story, but in the disciplined, synchronized steps of the city's own youth. Just when you think you've got a firm grasp on the Curetes, the mythological waters get wonderfully murky, because they are far from the only ecstatic, dancing brotherhood in the ancient world. To truly understand their unique identity, we need to untangle them from two other groups with whom they are constantly and understandably confused: the Corybantes and the Dactyls. Think of it as a case of divine mistaken identity, where three separate secret societies, each with their own headquarters and patron deity, got their membership rosters blended together over centuries of storytelling. The most frequent mix-up pairs the Curetes with the Corybantes. While the Curetes are intrinsically Cretan and tied to the infancy of Zeus, the Corybantes have a completely different origin story. They hail from Phrygia in Asia Minor, and their entire world revolves around the great mother goddess Cybele. Where the Curetes' dance was a calculated act of protection, the Corybantes' rituals were acts of pure, unbridled devotion to their ecstatic and often fearsome goddess. Their rites were legendary for their intensity, involving wild music, frenzied dancing, and even self-castration, mirroring the story of Cybele's beloved Attis. So, while both groups used drumming and dance to create an overwhelming cacophony, their core purpose was different. The Curetes were divine bodyguards executing a tactical mission. The Corybantes were priesthood lost in the rapture of their goddess. Then we have the Dactyls, a group that adds another fascinating layer to this puzzle. Their name means fingers, and they were said to be 10 in number, 5 male and 5 female, originating from the very same Cretan Mount Ida that sheltered the infant Zeus. But their expertise was not in guardian duties. They were the ancient world's first and greatest magical smiths. According to myth, they discovered the properties of iron and copper, mastering metalworking and sorcery in the fiery forges of the mountain. One of their most famous members was the master smith and sorcerer named, appropriately, the Idaean Dactyl. Here, the connection to the Curetes becomes geographical and thematic rather than functional. They shared a sacred mountain, and both were groups of male figures possessing extraordinary, earth-derived powers. It's easy to see how later poets might have woven them together, imagining the same beings who forged weapons also using them in a thunderous, protective dance. But their primary role sets them apart. The Dactyls were inventors and magicians, their power flowing from the anvil and the spell, not from the synchronized stomp of the warrior. So why did ancient authors so frequently blend these distinct groups into a single, noisy, dancing archetype? The syncretism, as scholars call it, wasn't born out of carelessness, but from a recognition of a powerful, recurring pattern in how the ancient Greeks understood the world. All three groups, Curetes, Corybantes, and Dactyls, represented a channeling of raw, primal, earthly power through organized, all-male brotherhoods. They were all seen as mediators between the civilized human world and the untamed, chaotic, and immensely fertile forces of nature. The ecstatic dance, the percussive music, the connection to specific mountains, these were all expressions of the same fundamental idea: that true power resided in the wild places and that it could be harnessed through ritual. When Greek culture expanded and encountered the worship of Cybele in Anatolia, they saw in her Corybantes a clear parallel to their own Curetes. It was a logical, almost inevitable cultural fusion that enriched the mythology of both regions, creating a more universal concept of the divine martial fraternity. Despite these overlaps, the Curetes stand apart because of one irrevocable and defining event, the infancy of Zeus. This is the anchor that secures their unique identity in the vast sea of Greek myth. While the Corybantes are forever linked to the cult of Cybele and the Dactyls to the forges of Mount Ida, the Curetes are immortalized by a single world-saving act on Crete. Their story is not one of ongoing religious service or craftsmanship, but of a finite, critical mission with cosmic consequences. This specific, foundational role in the origin story of the King of the Gods grants them a primacy that the others lack. They are not just attendants or artisans, they are the sworn protectors whose success made the Olympian age possible. This unique Cretan origin and their direct personal service to Zeus elevate them from being just one example of a common type to being the archetype itself. They are the original divine god, the blueprint against which all other similar groups were measured, their legend forever echoing from the specific, shadowy depths of a Cretan cave where the future of the universe once hung in the balance. But the protective clamor of the Curetes would have been impossible without the very tools they wielded, the bronze shields and iron-tipped spears that created their divine smokescreen. This brings us to another group of primordial figures who shared their sacred mountain, a brotherhood whose power lay not in dance but in the transformative heat of the forge, the Idaean Dactyls. Their name, meaning fingers, hints at their dexterous and numerous nature. They were often said to be 10 in number, 5 male and 5 female, and they were considered the original magical smiths of Greek mythology. While the Curetes were the masters of martial performance, the Dactyls were the masters of material creation. According to tradition, it was they who first discovered the secrets of working iron and copper within the fiery heart of Mount Ida, pulling these powerful metals from the earth and learning to hammer them into useful and magical forms. They weren't just blacksmiths, they were sorcerer artisans, their craft imbued with a deep, earthy magic that made their creation something more than mere metal. The fascinating overlap between the Dactyls and the Curetes creates a compelling picture of collaborative, earth-born power. It's not difficult to envision a symbiotic relationship on the slopes of Mount Ida, where the Dactyls, with their intimate knowledge of the mountain's metallic veins, forged the very weapons that the Curetes would so effectively employ. Imagine the scene. In one part of the mountain, the Dactyls would be stoking their mystical forges, the air thick with the smell of burning charcoal and the ringing sound of hammers on hot metal, shaping bronze into broad, resonant shields and iron into strong, sharp spearheads. These wouldn't be ordinary weapons, they would be objects of power, perhaps enchanted by the Dactyl spells to amplify their sound or to hold a protective energy within the metal itself. Then, in another part of the mountain, the Curetes would take these newly forged arms and integrate them into their frenzied dance, their stomping and clashing now channeling not just their own divine energy, but the latent power hammered into the metal by their mystical kin. This connection suggests that the protection of the infant Zeus was not the effort of a single group, but a coordinated operation involving different specializations of primal force. This blending of roles highlights a crucial theme in early Greek mythology, the indistinct boundary between different types of demonic powers. Before the clear hierarchies of the Olympian gods were established, the world was populated by a host of spirits and beings whose functions could overlap and intertwine. The Dactyls, as masters of metallurgy and magic, represented the Earth's hidden potential for order and technology, the ability to take raw, chaotic matter and shape it into a purposeful tool. The Curetes, as masters of martial dance and communal ritual, represented the Earth's raw, expressive energy, the power of sound, movement, and coordinated action. Both were expressions of the same primal, Cretan landscape, just channeled through different mediums. It was the collaboration between the creator and the user, the forger and the fighter, that created a defense so comprehensive it could shield a future king from the cosmic gaze of a Titan. The Dactyls provided the physical instruments of deception, while the Curetes provided the dynamic, living performance that gave those instruments their world-saving purpose. One of the most prominent dactyls, a figure who embodies their mystical nature, was simply known as the Idaean dactyl. He was remembered as a powerful sorcerer and a master of his craft, a proto-Hephaestus who worked his wonders long before the Olympian smith god was born. His legend reinforces the idea that the dactyl's contributions went beyond simple metalworking. Their involvement in the story of Zeus's infancy implies a layer of magical reinforcement to the entire operation. Perhaps the dactyls didn't just forge the shields, perhaps they inscribed them with ancient symbols of warding or sang spells of concealment over the cooling metal, binding their magic directly into the Curetes' arsenal. This transforms the protective cacophony from a simple loud noise into a multi-layered magical phenomenon. The sound that filled the cave was then not only physically deafening but also spiritually disruptive, woven with enchantments designed to baffle divine perception. The collaboration between these two groups illustrates a sophisticated understanding of defense, combining physical, auditory, and magical elements into a single, impenetrable system, ensuring that the most important secret in the universe remained hidden until the destined time for revelation. The thunderous myth of the Curetes protecting the infant Zeus is a captivating story, but it raises a compelling question. Did anyone actually worship these divine gods, and can we find their footprints in the physical world? The answer lies not just in ancient poems, but in the very soil of Crete, where archaeologists have unearthed a wealth of evidence that transforms these mythological figures into central players in the island's religious life. Two locations stand out as monumental cult centers, places where the boundary between myth and history becomes beautifully blurred. The Dictaean Cave, high on the Lassithi Plateau, and the Idaean Cave, nestled on the slopes of Crete's tallest mountain. These were not merely hiding spots in a story. For centuries, they were bustling sanctuaries where pilgrims journeyed to honor the birthplace and the protectors of the king of the gods. The Dictaean Cave, traditionally linked to the eastern part of the island, and the Idaean Cave, associated with the broader region of central Crete, both boasted a powerful claim to being the very spot where Rhea hid her son. This rivalry itself speaks volumes about the story's deep cultural significance, as different communities vied for the prestige of hosting such a foundational cosmic event. Within the cool, shadowy depths of these caverns, archaeologists have recovered a stunning array of votive offerings that give us a direct window into the minds of the ancient worshippers. Thousands of objects have been found, carefully deposited over many centuries as gifts to the divine inhabitants. Among the most poignant are intricately crafted bronze shields, both large and small. These aren't full-sized battle shields, but rather symbolic representations, often decorated with elaborate patterns or concentric circles. Finding these miniature shields in a cave sacred to the Curetes is incredibly significant. They are a direct material echo of the myth, a physical prayer left by a devotee who was reenacting the core element of the story, the clashing of shields that saved Zeus. Alongside these, figurines of armed dancers have been discovered, their dynamic poses frozen in time, seemingly caught in the midst of that same frantic, protective dance. The discovery of weapons and armor in these contexts strongly suggests that young men, perhaps those undergoing initiation into warriorhood, would dedicate their own gear to the Curetes, seeking the favor and embodying the virtues of these divine role models. The evidence becomes even more explicit with the discovery of inscriptions. At the site of Palicastro, not far from the eastern coast of Crete, a remarkable hymn was found inscribed on stone. This text, known as the Hymn of the Greatest Kuros, is a powerful piece of religious poetry that explicitly calls upon the Curetes and a youthful god, likely a local form of Zeus himself, to return to the island and leap for its prosperity. The hymn instructs the young men of the city to sing this song and to perform the leap, directly linking the mythological dance to a real, performed civic ritual. This isn't just an artifact, it's a preserved script for a ceremony, proving that the story was not passively believed but actively reenacted to channel divine power for the community's benefit. Other inscriptions from Knossos and elsewhere mention the Curetes by name, listing priests dedicated to their service or recording decrees made in their honor, solidifying their status as official deities within the Cretan religious landscape. This material record allows us to reconstruct the sensory experience of worship at these sites. A pilgrim ascending to the Idaean cave would not find a silent, empty grotto. Instead, they would encounter a space alive with activity and sound. The air would be thick with the smell of burning incense and the smoke of animal sacrifices offered at altars just outside the cave entrance. The dim interior, flickering with torchlight, would reveal niches and ledges overflowing with these votive gifts, the gleam of bronze shields, the silent figures of dancers, and piles of pottery. The most profound rituals likely involved ecstatic dancing and the deliberate, rhythmic clashing of cymbals and shields right there in the cave, creating a deafening echo that physically replicated the primordial event. This was a full immersion experience designed to make the worshipper feel as if they had stepped directly into the myth, participating in the ongoing protection of the god and, by extension, their own world. The archaeological finds show us that the Curetes were far more than characters in a tale. They were accessible powers whose legendary act of protection was a living force that could be summoned through ritual, dance, and the heartfelt dedication of a bronze shield left in the dark, sacred quiet of a Cretan cave. To truly appreciate the enduring power of the Curete story, we need to turn to the very texts that preserved their legend, tracing how different poets across centuries chose to highlight and reshape this foundational myth. Our journey through the literary record begins at the very dawn of Greek literature with Hesiod's Theogony, composed around the 8th or 7th century before the Common Era. This epic poem, which systematically details the origin of the gods, provides our earliest written account of the cosmic struggle between Cronus and Zeus. Hesiod sets the stage with chilling clarity, describing how Cronus swallowed each of his children as they were born, and how a grieving Rhea, upon the advice of her parents, devised her plan. He writes of her journey to Crete, to a fertile and hidden land, and of the birth of Zeus, who is swiftly whisked away to be raised by the nymphs. Yet, in this earliest version, the Curetes are present but not yet the stars of the show. Hesiod mentions them almost in passing, stating that the nymphs fed the infant god milk while the Curetes, the glorious inhabitants of Crete, were charged with his upbringing. They are there, a part of the divine nursery team, but the thunderous, clanging dance that would become their signature is not yet described. Hesiod's account establishes the basic facts of the deception, but the specific, noisy method of protection would be amplified by later writers who found deeper meaning in the ritualistic clamor. Following Hesiod, the voice of tradition shifts to the anonymous poets behind the Homeric hymns, particularly the hymn to Apollo. This composition, likely from the 6th century before the Common Era, offers a fascinating glimpse into how localized traditions began to intertwine. In this hymn, the goddess Leto, pregnant with Apollo, is searching for a place to give birth. She comes to the island of Delos, which fears it will be scorned by Apollo because of its rocky, barren nature. To reassure the island, Leto makes a great oath, swearing that a rich and glorious temple to Apollo will be built there. It is in this context that the poet mentions the Curetes, not on Crete, but as knowledgeable figures from whom Leto learned of Delos's suitability. This brief reference is incredibly telling. It shows that by this period, the Curetes were already proverbial for their wisdom and their connection to sacred geography. Their name had become a byword for ancient earth-based knowledge, a reputation that undoubtedly stemmed from their primary role as the guardians of Zeus. This allusion expands their influence beyond a single myth, positioning them as archaic sages whose counsel was sought even by other major deities. As we move into the 5th century, the lyric poet Pindar brings a new level of grandeur and theological weight to the story. In his first paean, Pindar revisits the infancy of Zeus, and his treatment is markedly more detailed and reverent. He specifically names the Dictaean cave as the sanctuary and explicitly credits the Curetes with hiding the infant's cries. For Pindar, their action is not just a practical solution, it is a sacred, cosmic deception. He elevates their clashing shields from a simple noise-making tactic to a profound act that fooled Cronus's freeness, his mind or consciousness. This is a critical evolution. Pindar internalizes the myth, suggesting the Curetes' deception worked on a psychological and spiritual level, baffling the Titan's very perception. Furthermore, Pindar strengthens the connection between the Curetes and the Dactyls, those mythical smiths, blending their identities and reinforcing the idea of a collaborative, earth-born brotherhood responsible for both forging the weapons and using them in the divine ritual. His poetic lens adds a layer of sophistication, framing the Curetes not just as gods, but as essential agents in a cosmic plan that required both physical and metaphysical concealment. The Hellenistic period, with its scholarly poets and fascination with arcane myths, produced one of the most vibrant and detailed accounts of all, Callimachus's Hymn to Zeus, written in the 3rd century before the Common Era. Callimachus, a librarian at the legendary Library of Alexandria, was a master of weaving together different local traditions into a rich, polished narrative. His hymn is a masterpiece of storytelling that doesn't just mention the Curetes, it places their ritual at the very heart of the drama. He begins by playfully questioning whether Zeus was born in Arcadia or Crete, a nod to the competing claims of various Greek cities before wholeheartedly endorsing the Cretan version. He then paints a vivid, almost cinematic scene within the Dictaean cave. He describes the newborn Zeus not as a helpless babe, but as a swiftly growing god already vibrant and powerful. And it is the Curetes who form his immediate, thunderous defense. Callimachus provides the specific, exhilarating details earlier sources lacked. He writes of them encircling the infant, of their feet pounding in the warlike dance, and of their shields crashing together again and again to mask his cries. In his account, their performance is so integral that Rhea herself presents the wrapped stone to Cronus only after the Curetes have begun their sacred work in the cave. Callimachus's version is the culmination of the myth's literary evolution, transforming the Curetes from background characters into the dynamic, percussive engine of the entire salvation plot. Finally, we see how the myth was kept alive in the world of epic adventure through the work of Apollonius of Rhodes in his Argonautica. Writing in the same era as Callimachus, Apollonius includes a beautiful and poignant digression when the hero Jason and his Argonauts stop on the island of Samothrace to be initiated into the mysteries of the gods there, who are called the Cabiri. As the local priests explain the rites, they trace their origin back to the Curetes, whom they identify as ancient inhabitants of Samothrace. According to this tradition, the Curetes had once, long ago, sheltered the infant Zeus in a cave on their island, dancing around him in full armor. This brief but significant reference demonstrates the myth's incredible geographic flexibility and its power to explain local cult practices. For a community in Samothrace claiming that the Curetes performed their famous dance right there on their island was a way to connect their own secretive, ecstatic rituals directly to the most important origin story of the Greek gods. It shows that the core image of armed dancers protecting a divine child was so powerful that it could be adapted and claimed by different regions, each weaving the Curetes into the fabric of their own sacred landscape. Analyzing this literary journey, from Hesiod's foundational outline to Callimachus's rich tapestry and Apollonius's localized adaptation, reveals a myth that was never static. It was a living narrative, constantly refined and reimagined, with the figure of the Curetes growing in importance and detail until their thunderous dance became the unforgettable, defining sound of Zeus's salvation. Yet for all their action and thunder, the story of the Curetes resonates on a much deeper frequency, one that transcends a simple tale of protection and speaks to the foundational principles of the cosmos itself. Ancient philosophers and later thinkers, looking past the surface of the myth, discovered within it a powerful allegory for the very nature of reality and the emergence of order from chaos. They saw the frantic, noisy dance not just as a clever trick, but as a symbolic representation of a universal process. The relentless clashing of bronze shields and spears, which so effectively concealed the infant's cries, was interpreted as a metaphor for the discordant, fundamental elements of the universe: earth, air, fire, and water, crashing against one another in their raw, unrefined state. In this philosophical reading, the cave becomes the primordial void, the chaos, where the basic building blocks of existence are in constant, tumultuous conflict. The infant Zeus, then, is not merely a baby god, but the nascent principle of order itself, the divine logos or cosmic mind that is destined to emerge from this cacophony and impose harmony upon it. The Curetes, through their violent, rhythmic dance, are not just hiding the child, they are actively forging the cosmos. Their dissonant noise is the necessary, chaotic process through which order is born, the violent symphony that must precede the establishment of a beautiful and stable universe. This interpretation beautifully aligns with the broader Greek philosophical pursuit of understanding how a single, unified cosmos could arise from a state of primal confusion. Think of the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus, who famously stated that strife is justice and that all things come to be through conflict. The myth of the Curetes acts out this very idea. The discord they create is not destructive in the ultimate sense, it is generative. It is the creative strife that hammers reality into its final, coherent form. The harmony of Zeus's future reign on Olympus is not possible without first passing through the dissonant, clanging workshop of that Cretan cave. The Curetes, therefore, become the cosmic artisans whose hammering and clashing are the essential, if violent, labor pains of a universe coming into being. Their dance is the physical manifestation of the chaotic forces willingly, or perhaps instinctively, organizing themselves around a nascent principle of order, protecting it until it is strong enough to govern on its own. Another profound layer of symbolism casts the Curetes in a different, yet equally vital, role, that of the civilizing force that tames the wild, untamed power of nature. Consider the identity of the god they are protecting. Zeus is not just any deity, he is the future god of the sky, the master of thunder and lightning, the embodiment of the most terrifying and destructive forces in the natural world. In his infancy, he represents that very power in its raw, uncontrolled, and potentially catastrophic state. A storm that has not yet learned to follow seasons or patterns is pure chaos. It is wild nature at its most fearsome. The Curetes, by surrounding this infant storm god, are symbolically containing and civilizing that raw power. Their disciplined, martial dance represents human culture, ritual, and society, the structures we create to channel and control the overwhelming forces of the natural world. They are teaching the thunder to roll in a predictable rhythm and the lightning to strike with purpose, not at random. This framing transforms the myth into an allegory for humanity's own journey. The wild, divine child is the untamed wilderness, the unpredictable fury of storms, earthquakes, and plagues that early civilizations sought to understand and appease. The Curetes, with their coordinated, ritualistic performance, represent the birth of agriculture, law, and religion, the tools we develop to build stable communities in the face of a chaotic environment. Their dance is a form of sympathetic magic, an attempt to rhythmically persuade the wild god to accept the binds of civilization. By nurturing Zeus within this framework of disciplined sound and movement, they are not quenching his power, but rather refining it, directing it, and ultimately convincing it to uphold a just cosmic order rather than unleashing mindless destruction. The Curetes, in this light, are the prototypes for priests, kings, and lawmakers, the figures who broker the delicate peace between humanity's need for order and nature's immense untamed power. Later interpreters, particularly during the Renaissance and into the modern era, took these philosophical seeds and cultivated them further, often seeing the Curetes as archetypes of initiation and pedagogical guardianship. The cave ceased to be just a hiding place and became a symbolic temenos, a sacred precinct for the mystery school of the soul. The infant Zeus transformed into a representation of the divine spark within each person, the potential for wisdom and spiritual awakening that is present but vulnerable in its early stages. The Curetes, then, are the rigorous mentors, the spiritual guides, and the demanding disciplines required to protect that inner spark from being devoured by the Cronus of our own lower nature, our ignorance, our base desires, and our distractions. Their clashing weapons are the intellectual and moral challenges, the difficult truths and rigorous debates that are necessary to drown out the noisy demands of the ego and allow the quiet voice of higher consciousness to grow strong. This reading finds echoes in philosophical traditions from Plato's allegory of the cave, where the journey to enlightenment is arduous and requires turning away from shadows, to the Stoic and Neoplatonic emphasis on daily discipline as a path to inner freedom. The Curetes' dance is the persistent, often discordant work of self-improvement. It is the practice of meditation that quietens a restless mind, the study of philosophy that challenges comfortable assumptions, and the ethical choices that conflict with immediate gratification. They are the personification of the hard work required to shield our nascent better nature until it is robust enough to govern our lives. In this deeply personal interpretation, the myth becomes a timeless map for individual psychological and spiritual development, reminding us that the cultivation of inner order is an active, protective, and sometimes fiercely noisy process, a sacred guard duty we must all perform upon the hidden, divine child within ourselves. As the cultural and political gravity of the ancient world shifted from the Greek city-states to the rising power of Rome, the myths and deities of the Hellenistic world underwent a fascinating process of translation and adaptation. The Romans, masters of administration and assimilation, rarely discarded foreign gods. Instead, they sought out their functional equivalents, weaving them into the rich tapestry of their own state religion. For the Curetes, this journey westward led to one of their most significant and complex transformations, a close identification with a mysterious group of deities known as the Cabiri, or in Latin, the Cabiri. This was not a simple name change, but a profound syncretism that merged the Cretan guardians with these obscure, powerful chthonic figures, creating a new divine amalgam that held great appeal for the Roman religious imagination. The Cabiri were originally worshipped in the northeastern Aegean, particularly on the island of Samothrace, where they were the central gods of an immensely popular and secretive mystery cult. Their origins were shrouded in antiquity, even to the Greeks, and they were understood as great but nameless gods, often referred to simply as the Mighty Ones. They were considered protectors of sailors, givers of fertility, and guardians against all manner of misfortunes, their power drawn from the deep, primal energies of the earth itself. When Roman writers and priests encountered the myth of the Curetes, they immediately saw a reflection of their own understanding of the Cabiri. The parallels were too compelling to ignore. Both groups were bands of youthful, male deities. Both were associated with vigorous, ecstatic dancing and the clashing of armor. Most importantly, both were fundamentally protective in nature. The Curetes had shielded the infant Zeus. The Cabiri were believed to shield initiates and sailors from the dangers of the sea and fate. This functional overlap made the fusion almost inevitable. To the Roman mind, they weren't two separate groups. They were regional expressions of the same divine force, a universal brotherhood of protective, martial spirits who presided over initiation, safety, and the raw power of the earth. The Roman poet Virgil masterfully encapsulates this fusion in his epic, the Aeneid, when he describes the origins of the Trojans, and by extension, the Romans. He traces them back to the Corybantes, another name in this complex family, who performed their armed dance on Mount Ida. In doing so, Virgil directly links the foundational myth of Rome to the same primal, protective energy embodied by the Curetes and Cabiri, grounding Roman identity in this ancient, cosmic narrative of guardianship. This syncretism was most visibly enacted in the Roman adoption and adaptation of mystery cults, particularly those with strong Eastern influences. The most significant of these was the cult of Magna Mater, the Great Mother, who was the Roman interpretation of the Phrygian goddess Cybele. When her worship was officially imported to Rome during the Second Punic War in 204 BCE, in a desperate attempt to secure divine favor, her exotic, ecstatic priesthood came with her. These priests, the Galli, were famous for their frenzied rites, which involved wild music, drumming, and dancing. While the Galli themselves were a distinct priesthood, the mythological attendants of Cybele were the Corybantes, and through the established connection, the Romans easily saw the Curetes and the Cabiri in this same divine retinue. Therefore, when a Roman citizen witnessed the tumultuous procession for Magna Mater through the streets of Rome, with its clashing cymbals and frantic dances, they were witnessing a performance that they understood, on a mythological level, to be the same as that of the Curetes protecting Zeus. The protective, martial nature of these deities resonated deeply with core Roman values like virtus, manly courage, and pietas, duty to the gods, state, and family. The image of a disciplined band of warriors using noise and coordinated movement to defend a sacred principle was a perfect metaphor for the Roman legions themselves, protecting the sanctity and order of the Roman state. The physical presence of this fused cult is powerfully attested by archaeology, particularly in the ruins of Pompeii. In the House of the Vetii, a stunning fresco depicts the infant Zeus, known to the Romans as Jupiter, being nursed by the goat Amalthea. But standing guard around them are not figures labeled as Curetes. They are the Cabiri, unmistakably identified by their attributes and the context of the painting. This visual evidence in a wealthy Roman home shows how completely the two groups had merged in the popular Roman consciousness. They were the divine bodyguards of the king of the gods, their story a cherished part of the mythological landscape. Their worship was not confined to state-sponsored cults. It permeated domestic religion, offering protection and divine favor to individual households. This demonstrates the remarkable journey of these deities from the specific caves of Crete to the cosmopolitan villas of the Roman Empire, their identity evolving yet their core function, as fierce, loyal protectors remaining constant, a testament to the universal and enduring appeal of their myth. Moving from the earthly rituals and philosophical interpretations, our gaze now lifts from the shadowy Cretan cave to the starry expanse of the night sky, where the legacy of Zeus's infancy is permanently etched in constellations. The nurturing she-goat Amalthea, who provided the infant god with life-sustaining milk, did not fade into obscurity after her nursling outgrew the need for her. Instead, her story reached its ultimate conclusion not on the slopes of Mount Ida, but in the glittering heavens. Upon her death, the great god Zeus, eternally grateful for her service, bestowed upon her an honor reserved for the most significant figures of myth. He transformed her into a constellation. Her celestial form is widely identified with the brilliant golden star Capella, the little she-goat, which serves as the brightest light in the constellation Auriga, the charioteer. There she shines, a permanent beacon commemorating the gentle, life-giving care that fortified the future king of the gods during his most vulnerable years. A constant reminder that even the mightiest powers in the universe once depended on the kindness of humble guardians. Yet Amalthea's physical form provided two further artifacts of immense power, objects that would play crucial roles in the established Olympian order. Her hide, tough and imbued with the divine energy of the one who nourished Zeus, was not simply discarded. It was transformed into one of the most formidable and iconic defensive items in all of mythology, the Aegis. This was not a typical shield. The Aegis was a divine mantle of power, a shimmering, goatskin cloak or shield that radiated an aura of invincible terror. Zeus himself would wield it in battle, but it is perhaps most famously associated with his daughter, Athena, the goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare. The aegis became her defining attribute, often depicted as a fringed cape or a shield emblazoned with the horrifying head of the Gorgon Medusa. When Athena brandished the aegis, it would create a storm of panic and confusion among her enemies, a supernatural clamor that echoed the protective cacophony of the Curetes themselves. This direct lineage is profoundly significant. The very skin of the nurturing goat became the ultimate symbol of divine protection for the next generation of gods, linking Athena's strategic defense directly back to the primal, earthy guardianship that saved her father. The second incredible artifact born from Amalthea's body was her horn. In one version of the myth, while playing with the divine goat, the young Zeus accidentally broke off one of her horns. Filled with remorse and wishing to atone for the injury to his beloved nurse, he magically endowed the horn with a wondrous property. It would forever be filled with whatever food or drink its owner desired. This became the legendary cornucopia, the horn of plenty. It is a symbol that has transcended its mythological origins to become a universal emblem of abundance, prosperity, and nourishment. In the hands of deities like Plutus, the god of wealth, or the personified goddess Tyche, the spirit of fortune, the cornucopia represents the boundless generosity of the earth. The transformation of a broken horn into an unending source of sustenance completes the symbolic cycle of Amalthea's role. She began as a literal source of nourishment for a single infant god, and through her horn became a perpetual, metaphorical source of nourishment for the entire world, her gift of abundance echoing through the ages. This brings us back to the stars, to the constellation Auriga, which presents a captivating puzzle that beautifully intertwines these myths. Auriga is most commonly depicted as a charioteer holding a whip, but the constellation's most prominent feature is the unmistakably bright star Capella. Ancient astronomers and mythographers were faced with a celestial image that didn't perfectly fit the simple story of a charioteer and a goat. To resolve this, they wove a more complex narrative. One compelling interpretation suggests that the figure of Auriga is not just any charioteer, but represents the hero Erychthonius, an early king of Athens who was credited with inventing the four-horse chariot. In this telling, he is not holding a goat but carrying the she-goat and her kids, an act of compassion and protection that mirrors the care given to Zeus. Another, even more poignant interpretation posits that Auriga is actually a depiction of the infant Zeus himself, cradling his beloved goat Amalthea in a permanent celestial embrace. This ambiguity only enriches the constellation story, allowing it to represent both the protector and the protected, forever linked in the cosmos. The presence of Capella within Auriga turns the entire constellation into a grand, starry monument not just to Amalthea, but to the entire network of Zeus's early protectors. When you locate the bright, golden-hued Capella in the winter sky, you are looking at the divine goat, but the surrounding stars of Auriga can then be seen as a celestial representation of the Curetes themselves, the divine gods forever standing watch around their charge. The faint cluster of stars known as the Kids or Hedi, located near Capella, can be interpreted as the playful young companions of the she-goat, adding another layer to the nurturing scene. This celestial memorialization served a profound purpose for ancient cultures. By projecting these foundational myths onto the immutable night sky, they were creating a permanent, cyclical record of their beliefs. Every year, as Auriga and Capella rose prominently in the winter heavens, the story of Zeus's salvation was retold, reinforcing the cultural values of loyalty, nurturing care, and the profound debt that even the highest power owes to its humble beginnings. The stars became a divine storybook, ensuring that the tale of the infant god, his thunderous guards, and his nurturing goat would never, ever be forgotten. From the echoing clamor of ancient caves, the story of the Curetes made a stunning leap onto the canvases and clay pots of artists, who sought to capture the frantic energy of the divine nursery. Our earliest visual records of these guardians come from the skilled hands of Greek vase painters, who immortalized the scene on the curved surfaces of black and red figure pottery. On a vibrant red figure crater from the 5th century before the Common Era, you might see the infant Zeus, small but central, cradled by a nymph or perhaps the goat Amalthea. Circling them are the Curetes, rendered as idealized, athletic youths in the prime of their strength, their bodies caught in mid-motion. They are almost always shown armed, bearing tall, double-grip shields and brandishing spears or swords, which they are depicted in the very act of clashing together. The artists masterfully used the limited space to convey a sense of perpetual motion. The Curetes are not standing guard but dancing, their legs bent as if stomping, their bodies leaning into the rhythm of their protective ritual. The scene is one of controlled chaos, a frozen moment of deafening noise, where the visual narrative perfectly complements the literary one, emphasizing the youthful vigor and martial discipline of these divine protectors. As cultural influence shifted from Greece to Rome, the artistic focus on the Curetes evolved, reflecting the different values and funerary practices of the Roman world. They appear less frequently on everyday pottery and more prominently on the elaborate marble sarcophagi of the wealthy elite. In this funerary context, the myth took on a new, deeply personal layer of meaning. A Roman sarcophagus carved with the scene of the infant Zeus and the Curetes was not merely a decoration. It was a powerful symbol of hope for salvation and rebirth in the afterlife. The Romans, who had syncretized the Curetes with their own protective deities like the Cabiri, saw in this myth a promise of divine protection that transcended death. The frantic dance that once saved a god was now a prayer etched in stone, a belief that similar divine gods would protect the soul of the deceased on its journey to the next world. The artistic style on these sarcophagi is often more robust and dramatic than the graceful lines of Greek vases, with the Curetes depicted as powerfully built, almost monumental figures, their dance feeling both heavier and more solemn, fitting for its new context as a monument to mortality and the hope for eternal safeguarding. The myth slumbered through much of the Middle Ages, a period more concerned with biblical narratives than pagan cosmogonies, but it was spectacularly reborn during the Renaissance. As scholars and artists rediscovered classical texts, they found in the story of Zeus's infancy a thrilling subject bursting with dynamism and drama. One of the most breathtaking early Renaissance interpretations is found in the Palazzo del Te in Mantua, created by the workshop of the master artist Giulio Romano. In a stunning fresco, Romano unleashes the full force of his Mannerist style upon the scene. The composition is a whirlwind of muscular, twisting figures. The Curetes are no longer the serene youths of Greek vases. They are powerful, almost superhuman beings, their bodies contorted in an ecstatic, violent dance. You can almost hear the explosive crash of their weapons through the painted frenzy. Romano uses sharp contrasts of light and shadow to heighten the drama, illuminating a Curete in mid-leap while another is shrouded in the smoky gloom of the cave, creating a palpable sense of chaos and urgency that pulls the viewer directly into the heart of the mythological event. This dramatic intensity was pushed even further during the Baroque period, an artistic era defined by its desire to evoke powerful emotions and a sense of awe. Artists of the 17th century, like the Flemish painter Jacob Jordaens, embraced the Curete story for its inherent theatricality. In Jordaens' work, the scene is treated with a robust, earthy realism. The Curetes feel less like idealized gods and more like burly, rustic soldiers, their faces etched with the strain of their frantic performance. The Baroque fascination with movement and energy is everywhere in the billowing cloaks, the flying limbs, and the dramatic gestures that seem to burst beyond the confines of the canvas. The use of rich, deep colors and a technique called chiaroscuro, the strong interplay of light and dark, makes the scene feel immediate and tangible. The darkness of the cave is a palpable presence, making the lit figures of the dancing Curetes and the radiant infant Zeus appear all the more miraculous and vulnerable, emphasizing the high stakes of their protective ritual in a way that was both visually and emotionally overwhelming for the viewer. When we compare these artistic depictions across the centuries, a fascinating evolution of cultural values comes into focus. The ancient Greek vase painters were primarily concerned with narrative clarity and the idealized human form. Their Curetes are archetypes of youthful, martial beauty, their dance a balanced and rhythmic part of a cosmic story. The Roman sarcophagi shift the emphasis from cosmic narrative to personal salvation, using the myth as a symbolic shield for the soul. The Renaissance, fueled by humanist ideals, reimagined the Curetes through the lens of classical learning and anatomical precision, celebrating the power and potential of the human body as Giulio Romano did in his muscular, heroic figures. Finally, the Baroque artists, living in an age of religious wars and intense emotional expression, amplified the drama to its peak. For them, the myth was not just a story to be told, but an experience to be felt, a sensory overload of noise, movement, and divine intervention designed to inspire wonder and belief in the power of protection, no matter the source. Through this continuous chain of artistic reimagination, the Curetes were never forgotten. They were perpetually rediscovered, their thunderous dance finding new life and new meaning in every fresh splash of paint on a wall or stroke of a chisel on marble. While their thunderous dance may have faded from the caves of Crete, the rhythmic echo of the Curetes has never truly disappeared. These primal guardians have found a vibrant new life in the landscapes of contemporary imagination, particularly within the realms of fantasy literature and role-playing games, where their archetypal power resonates with modern storytellers. In these genres, the Curetes are often reimagined as ancient, nature-aligned orders of warrior dancers or mystical sentinels, their essence preserved even if their names are sometimes altered. You can see their clear lineage in fictional brotherhoods like the Warders from Robert Jordan's The Wheel of Time or the Druids of the Talons from certain fantasy settings. Elite groups whose martial discipline is deeply intertwined with ritualistic dance and a sacred duty to protect a hidden, world-changing power. Their role is no longer to shield a single infant god, but to guard entire realms, ancient secrets, or the delicate balance of nature itself, translating their mythological function into a modern epic context. This translation is perhaps most explicit and systematic within the vast, rules-defined universes of tabletop and digital role-playing games. In games like Dungeons & Dragons, the Curetes serve as direct inspiration for monster manual entries and character archetypes. They might appear as a type of fey creature or an elite monster known as the Rhea, depicted as frenzied, spear-wielding dancers who inhabit sacred groves and are fiercely territorial. Game designers tap directly into their core mythological traits. They are often granted special abilities that allow them to create a cacophony, imposing disadvantages on enemies who rely on hearing or concentration, a perfect game mechanic representation of the sonic smokescreen they use to protect Zeus. For players, choosing a class like a ranger with the Fey Wanderer archetype or a barbarian following a path of the ancestral guardian is a way to role-play the Curetic archetype. These characters become the lone protector, their combat style a whirlwind of movement and noise, defending their party with the same fervor the divine guards showed their charge. In this interactive space, players don't just hear about the Curetes. They actively embody their virtues of loyalty, martial prowess, and a deep connection to the wild. Beyond the structured rules of games, the mythic energy of the Curetes also pulses through modern poetry and music, where they are invoked not as literal characters but as symbols of raw, untamable power and the fierce defense of the vulnerable. The American poet Robinson Jeffers, known for his philosophy of inhumanism, which emphasizes the sublime power of nature over humanity, channels a Curetic spirit in his work. While he may not name them directly, his poems are filled with the imagery of rugged coastal cliffs, hawks, and violent, beautiful natural forces that stand as eternal, protective sentinels, indifferent to human concerns yet embodying a primal form of guardianship over the earth itself. This is the Curetes' essence stripped back to its elemental core, not a personal protection but a cosmic, environmental one. In music, particularly within subgenres of heavy metal and folk metal that draw on mythological themes, the rhythmic, percussive assault of the music itself mimics their frantic dance. Bands like Illuvati, with their Gaulish themes and use of harsh vocals layered over driving percussion and flutes, create a sonic landscape that feels like a modern retelling of an ancient, ecstatic rite. The relentless double bass drumming and the clashing of guitars become the contemporary equivalent of spears striking shields, invoking the same chaotic, protective frenzy that once filled a Cretan cave. This enduring presence reveals something profound about the power of archetypes. The Curetes survive because they embody a universal and eternally relevant concept: the need for fierce, loyal protection of that which is nascent, vulnerable, and vitally important. In a modern context, this translates into our cultural fascination with bodyguards, elite military units, and even the protective instincts we feel for our own families and communities. They represent the moment when defense becomes an active, dynamic, and almost artistic expression of power. Their specific story is ancient, but the pattern they represent, the band of loyal warriors using their unique skills to create a safe space for growth, is a story we never tire of telling. They have successfully transitioned from figures of state religion in the ancient world to a versatile narrative tool, a symbolic shorthand for a particular kind of primal, honorable, and earth-connected guardianship. Their journey from the pages of Hesiod to the digital realms of fantasy games and the visceral energy of a metal song proves that some myths are too powerful to be confined to the past. They continue to capture our imagination because at their core, the Curetes remind us of the profound, often noisy, and always necessary work of shielding what we hold most sacred from the consuming chaos of the world. Now, let's step back from the ancient world and turn the lens inward, because this is far more than just a story about gods on a mountain. It's a powerful, enduring blueprint for the human journey itself. Seen through the framework of modern psychology, particularly the work of Carl Jung, the myth of the Curetes and the infant Zeus transforms into a stunning allegory for the development of our own inner selves. In this reading, the characters cease to be merely external deities and become living symbols of the universal forces and archetypes that shape our psyches. At the heart of this drama is the figure of Cronus, the paranoid titan who devours his children. He represents a profoundly destructive psychological force, the devouring parent, the critical inner voice, or the rigid, fear-based patterns of the unconscious that seek to consume our nascent potential before it can ever truly live. He is the part of us that, terrified of change and the unknown, swallows our creative impulses, our vulnerabilities, and our hopes, imprisoning them in a dark, internal stasis to maintain a familiar, albeit oppressive, status quo. In direct opposition to this devouring force stands the infant Zeus, the future king of the gods hidden away in a cave. Jungian psychology identifies this figure as the archetype of the divine child, a symbol of the nascent self, the seed of our wholeness, individuality, and untapped potential. This is not a literal child, but the vulnerable, burgeoning core of who we are meant to become. It's our innate creativity, our capacity for authentic connection, our unique genius, or simply the fragile beginning of a new and better way of living. Like the infant god, this inner potential is radiant and powerful, but it is also incredibly vulnerable in its early stages. It must be hidden away from the inner Cronus, from our own self-doubt, our ingrained negative beliefs, and the crushing weight of external expectations that would snuff it out before it has a chance to grow. The cave, then, becomes the protected inner sanctum of the psyche, the secret space of incubation where this true self can develop far from the judging, consuming gaze of our own critical consciousness. This is precisely where the Curetes perform their most vital psychological work. They emerge as the perfect embodiment of the protector archetype, a fierce, active defense system mobilized by the psyche itself to safeguard its most precious charge. Their frantic, noisy dance is not just a physical act, it's a brilliant metaphor for the psychological strategies we must employ to protect our growing self. The relentless clashing of their spears and shields represents the conscious, deliberate noise we must create to drown out the inner critic. Think of the affirmations we repeat to counter negative self-talk, the busy, productive work we lose ourselves in to avoid ruminating on fears, or the supportive communities we build whose collective belief in us shouts down our own insecurities. This protective cacophony is a form of psychic insulation. It doesn't silence the inner Cronus. That devouring voice may always be there, but it creates so much disruptive, positive energy that its toxic messages cannot be clearly heard or acted upon, allowing the divine child within the safe space it needs to mature. The role of the nymphs and their divine nourishment adds another essential layer to this inner process. Amalthea's milk and the Melissa nymph's honey symbolize the nurturing, life-giving resources the psyche requires to fortify its nascent self. This is the emotional and spiritual sustenance we seek out, the wisdom from books and mentors, the comfort of therapy, the beauty of art, the unconditional love of friends, or the simple, quiet practices of self-care that feed our soul. Ambrosia and nectar, the food of the gods, represent those transcendent moments of insight, inspiration, and profound connection that fundamentally change us, weaving threads of resilience and confidence into our very being. This holistic system of care shows that protection is not merely about building walls. It is about actively providing the nutrients that foster robust inner growth. The psyche, in its wisdom, understands that the hidden self needs both a shield from harm and a constant source of enrichment to evolve from a fragile potential into a formidable, ruling force in our lives. Ultimately, the entire myth maps onto the universal human journey of individuation, the process of becoming a whole, integrated individual. The moment when a mature Zeus emerges from the cave to free his siblings and challenge Cronus is the powerful climax of this inner drama. It represents the point at which the nurtured and protected self grows strong enough to consciously confront and integrate the destructive aspects of the psyche. This isn't about destroying a part of ourselves, but about forcing it to disgorge what it has consumed, to release the trapped energies, talents, and potentials we had locked away out of fear. The victorious Zeus doesn't kill Cronus, he imprisons him in Tartarus, a symbolic act of rendering our old, dysfunctional patterns powerless, confining them so they can no longer control our lives. The Curetes' successful guardianship made this liberation possible. In our own lives, this translates to the moment when the potential we fiercely protected, a new skill, a healed relationship, a creative project, a more authentic identity, becomes so solid and powerful that it can now reorganize our entire inner world, establishing a new, more conscious and harmonious reign from which we can finally live as the true authors of our own destiny. And so, despite all the vivid imagery of their thunderous dance and their clear, world-saving function, the story of the Curetes ultimately leaves us standing at the edge of a profound and captivating mystery. We know what they did, but so many questions about their fundamental nature remain tantalizingly unanswered, shrouded in the same mist that once clung to the peaks of Mount Ida. Why were they specifically chosen for this most sacred of duties? Were they divine volunteers appointed by Gaia herself, or were they simply the indigenous powers of that specific Cretan landscape, the only ones who could possibly perform the task? The ancient texts never quite clarify the selection process, presenting their presence as almost a given, an elemental part of the story's fabric. This lack of explanation hints at a truth about mythology. Some elements are so foundational, so deeply rooted in a culture's understanding of the world that they don't require a backstory. The Curetes were simply there as inherent to the birth of Zeus as the earth or the sky. The ambiguity deepens when we try to pin down the exact nature of their being. Were they gods, a formal brotherhood of lesser deities? Were they spirits, daemons of the wild, animated by the raw power of the mountain? Or were they something in between, a concept that the ancient Greeks didn't feel the need to rigidly categorize? This fluidity is a feature, not a bug, of early Greek religious thought. It suggests that the Curetes represent a primal force that existed before the tidy hierarchies of the Olympian pantheon were fully established. They belong to a rougher, more chaotic and more immediate world, where the line between a place and the spirit that inhabits it is wonderfully blurred. Their identity wasn't defined by a family tree on Mount Olympus, but by their action and their function. They were defined not by what they were, but by what they did, the deafening, protective dance that became their sole reason for being in the mythological record. This very ambiguity is what has allowed them to be so easily syncretized with other groups like the Corybantes and the Dactyls. They are less a specific set of characters and more a powerful, recurring archetype of ecstatic, martial protection. This leads us to one of the most compelling and widely discussed theories among historians and archaeologists: the idea that the Curetes are not purely a mythological invention, but rather a mythologized memory of an actual historical practice. The setting is crucial here. Crete was the heart of the magnificent Minoan civilization, a culture that flourished long before the rise of classical Greece. We know from archaeological evidence, most famously the breathtaking frescoes from the Palace of Knossos, that the Minoans had rich and vibrant rituals involving bull leaping, processions, and ecstatic dancing. These were not mere performances. They were likely central to their religious and social life, often tied to rites of passage for young men. Imagine groups of Minoan youths undergoing a grueling initiation deep within a sacred cave or on a secluded mountainside. As part of their ritual to shed their childhood and emerge as warriors and full members of the community, they would engage in fierce, synchronized dances, pounding their feet on the earth and clashing their weapons together to demonstrate their strength, discipline, and collective spirit. Over centuries, as the Mycenaean Greeks rose to power and later cultures inherited these stories, the memory of these powerful Minoan initiation rites could have slowly transformed. The specific historical context faded, but the potent image of the armed, dancing youth persisted. What was once a human ritual marking the transition to adulthood became elevated into a divine drama. The initiate's symbolic death and rebirth were reimagined as the protection of a god from a devouring father. The physical clamor meant to drive away evil spirits or prove martial readiness was reinterpreted as a cosmic smokescreen to hide a baby's cries from a Titan. In this light, the myth of the Curetes becomes a beautiful piece of cultural palimpsest, a later civilization writing its own epic stories over the faint but indelible ink of a much older reality. The Curetes, then, are a bridge connecting the historical practices of a lost Bronze Age world to the grand cosmic narratives of the classical era. This theory doesn't diminish their power, it deepens it. It roots their thunderous dance not in abstract divinity, but in the very real, sweat-soaked and profound human experiences of community, initiation, and the fierce desire to protect what is most vulnerable. It suggests that the ancient Greeks, in telling the story of Zeus's infancy, were unconsciously reaching back to a shared ancestral memory, dressing their gods in the rituals of their predecessors. The unanswered questions, therefore, are not a failure of the myth, but rather the source of its enduring fascination. The mystery of the Curetes reminds us that mythology is not always a neat collection of answers intended to explain the world. Often, it is a resonant echo of our own deepest human practices, a way of preserving the emotional and spiritual weight of our rituals long after their original meaning has been lost to time. The Curetes stand forever in that liminal space between history and legend, their spears still clashing, their dance never ending, challenging us to listen not just for the story, but for the ancient human heartbeat thrumming beneath the divine clamor. From the echoing darkness of a Cretan cave to the gleaming heights of Mount Olympus, the story of the Curetes is the story of a cosmos saved by a calculated cacophony. We have traced their epic journey from the moment a desperate Rhea entrusted them with her most precious son, through their thunderous ritual that masked the infant's cries from a paranoid Titan, to their ultimate reward as founders of sacred mysteries. It is a narrative that forces us to confront a profound truth. Without their chaotic, loyal protection, the entire order of the Greek cosmos as we know it might never have come to be. There would have been no Zeus to free his siblings, no Titanomachy to overthrow the old tyranny, and no pantheon of Olympian gods to preside over a new age of gods and mortals. The Curetes were the crucial, often overlooked linchpin in the greatest succession myth of the ancient world, the guardians of the spark that would ignite a new celestial regime. Their legacy is a beautifully dualistic one, a study in harmonious contradictions. They were, first and foremost, fierce warriors, their discipline and martial prowess honed to a razor's edge. They stood as an impenetrable wall of bronze and resolve, their very presence a declaration that the future king would be defended to the last. Yet simultaneously, they were ecstatic dancers, their movements a form of primal, sacred expression. The same hands that gripped spears with lethal intent also moved in a rhythmic, almost poetic frenzy, channeling the raw energy of the earth itself. This fusion of the martial and the mystical is what made them uniquely suited for their task. They were not just soldiers, nor were they merely priests. They were the perfect synthesis of force and faith, using the violent music of clashing metal to perform a work of the most delicate cosmic importance. This mythological power did not remain confined to the pages of epic poetry. As we have seen, the Curetes seamlessly crossed the boundary from story into substance, becoming objects of genuine, fervent religious devotion. In the cults of Crete and later in the syncretic practices of the Roman world, they were not just characters to be remembered but powers to be invoked. Young men danced their Pyrrhic dance in city streets and sacred groves, not as a simple reenactment, but as a potent act of sympathetic magic, believing they could channel the same protective energy to safeguard their own communities. They became archetypes for initiation, role models for warriorhood, and divine guarantors of civic and personal safety. Their story was a living force, a ritual script that connected everyday people to the foundational moments of their universe. So, as our exploration concludes, let us hold in our minds a final, powerful image. It is not of the triumphant Zeus hurling lightning bolts from his celestial throne, nor of the mighty Olympians feasting in their golden halls. Instead, it is an image from the beginning, from the vulnerable, hidden heart of the myth. Picture that dark cave on Mount Ida, lit by the flicker of torchlight. In the center rests a divine infant, the weight of the future heavy upon his small shoulders, and surrounding him a circle of figures in relentless motion. Their feet stamp against the stone floor in a rhythm as old as the earth, their bodies a blur of disciplined fury. The air vibrates with the deafening, percussive roar of bronze striking bronze, a wall of sound so immense it swallows all else. This is the moment of creation, not of the world, but of a new world order. This is the eternal, resonant echo of the Curetes' dance, the fierce, loyal, and thunderous guardians of a god's first breath, whose unwavering watch ensured that a whisper of hope would not be extinguished, but would instead grow to become the thunder that